Welcome back to Within Tolerance Podcast, a podcast for machinists by a machinist. I'm your host, Dylan Jackson from Protean Machining, and this week I'm joined by Chris Bathgate. So welcome, Chris.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So for those who don't follow you on Instagram or your website or anything, what do you do? Where can they find you so they can pull you up while they're listening to the interview?
Sure. So I am a machinist sculptor. So I do machine work from the perspective of creating fine art, and it's sort of an interesting space to sort of mash up something that's inherently like sort of an engineering right brain sort of activity with a creative aspect of creating something that has no function at all, which would be fine art. And so for anyone who's not familiar with my work, you can find me on Instagram at c_Bathgate or online at www.chrisbathgate.com. Quick Google search will find you a couple of other places too. So
Awesome. Well, let's get into your backstory. How did you start down this machining route? Because I know I've seen some of your posts where you used to do some welding as well, and it sounds like this is just the most recent iteration of your art form. So how did you? I guess where did you start this journey, and how did you kind of jump into machining?
So I sort of stumbled upon it quite by accident. I didn't grow up in a family that had any sort of history with machine work or doing manufacturing of any kind, and so actually, my art career started with dropping out of art school. I sort of went to art school as a a young man looking to gain technical knowledge, to learn how to use equipment to build things. I was very interested in sort of structural art, and I wanted to make these big things, and I had ideas about what I wanted to make in metal and things like that. And then when I got to art school, it was not very technical at all. It was much more conceptual. There was a lot of critique and talking, and there wasn't a whole lot. At least the first year I went to school, there wasn't actually any hard skill teaching, and I was sort of bothered by that. And so I dropped out and just started buying tools and equipment. And I had some experience welding. I worked for a foundry when I was in college to sort of pay the bills. So I actually learned a lot more this part-time day job at a foundry than I was learning in my sculpture classes. And so I just sort of picked up where I left off there and started buying equipment. So yeah, I got my start doing fabricated sculpture work. And I didn't really have a very good beat of what machine work was, but as my fabrication work evolved, I did start researching tools that would help me sort of build on that, and I kind of fell into machining from there. I just picked up a very cheap milling machine, taught myself how to use it, bought a cheap lathe, taught myself how to use it, and I just from each of those very simple experiences of just buying a tool and figuring out what it's good for, I would roll those into sculptural ideas, and that sort of became my sort of operating system for how I would come up with ideas for new work. It wasn't like I want to make this specific object, and so I need to figure out how to make it. It was I want to learn this particular skill and make objects about learning that skill. And so I would, most of my early work is based on that idea of constant learning and folding those experiences into a visual aesthetic of just sort of exploring what that's good for visually.
That's great. Yeah, actually, last week's guest, Josh Hacko, he said almost the same thing verbatim about how they come up with their finishes on their watches. He was like,
Okay.
I'm playing with finishes and anodizing techniques on titanium, and when I find something I like, I create an aesthetic around it. And so it's very interesting to hear. Like I consider a lot of his watches as art pieces as well, and so it's interesting to hear multiple artists say that about machining and art together.
Yeah, I think there's a certain, machine work lends itself to a certain technical minded person. And so, even when you do kind of fall into that more creative community, it's really, it all hinges on this sort of love of process and this love of craft. So everything kind of spins out from that. And there's definitely like areas in the fine arts where it's just high concept, low skill, banana duct tape kind of art, and that's got its own appeal. But that doesn't do it for me in terms of idea generation. I really need to have my hands in something tactile and something real, and sort of let that resonate and come up with ideas from there.
Totally. So stepping back a little bit, you had mentioned you wanted to go to art school for building art, and so what
Sure.
kind of things inspired you to go down that route? Like what did you want to make before you started in art school?
I mean, so I got into sculpture in high school. I had a very rudimentary lesson in doing some, torch welding and brazing, and I was making these sort of like steel stick foot, just quarter-inch steel rod sort of structural pieces. And I was starting to play with concrete and, embedding steel and concrete. And so I was really into like that really structural kind of way of thinking about making objects. And so I had hoped when I went to art school, I could kind of build on that and just sort of, when if you look in art books and you look in back in art history, everything there's like, David Smith, pieces. There are these like beautiful abstract objects, but they're also like highly crafted metal objects, and they're welded. And his approach to welding was such as a painter, and so there's this foundation of that idea in the arts. But when you're young, you just sort of assume that you're going to jump right into that sort of mode of making things. And then when you get to, college, you're like, no, 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 no. We need to learn the basics. And the basics for me were very different, right? The basics for some of my peers who had never sawed a piece of wood with a handsaw or anything like that was very different than someone like me who already had a lot of experience in making things and working with welding. And my sculpture teacher didn't really know how to work. We were actually sitting. We were for class. We were sitting in this huge metal shop. There was like band saws and drill presses and welding machines lined against the wall. And I was excited about that on the first day of class. And he kind of comes in and he says, welcome to Sculpture One. There's all this equipment, but we can't use it because I don't know how to use any of it. And I was just like,
Oh,
oh, that's disappointing. And at some point in the class, I was like, it was sort of a very rudimentary sculpture class folded into also like a bronze casting program. And we were sort of handheld through the process of doing a bronze casting. But there were like TAs there to help us. And it was one of those things where you're helped so much, you don't learn very much. They sort of hold your hand really really hard through the process, and you're just kind of following the steps, but you don't really retain any of it because and I like and like I said, I was actually working at a foundry during this time, so I was doing mold making and wax work, and so it was sort of redundant, and it was all sort of just me feeling like I was spinning wheels. Like it was a lot of redundant information, and it was sort of presented in this way that was very infantilizing, and I didn't like it. I just wanted to run with my ideas, and I wanted to build these big sort of concrete weighted mechanisms that like use their own weight to clamp onto walls and things like that. But I wasn't like in a position to do any of it in that environment. And so actually in the weekends I would go back to my old high school and asked the teacher, she would let me in and let me use their welding equipment. And so it was like, I just didn't know why I was there, and so I
right.
just dropped out, and it wasn't a great fit. So I just sort of realized that I was sort of a self learner, and decided to, if it needed to be done, I would just teach it to myself.
Well, it seems like it's worked. I mean, I was talking to somebody. I think you posted that video recently on Instagram, going through your process on your latest larger sculpture.
Hmm.
And this is kind of a preempt to my next question, which is what is your machinery currently? But I had assumed, looking at the level of your sculpture, I was like, oh, he's got to have like machinos and top level machinery that he's doing all this on. Like, I don't know where his shop is, and I was just like so impressed that you are doing such high level work on not those kind of machines, not
Hmm.
a $500,000 mill or something like that. So you mentioned on your website that you kind of retrofit or refurbish older machinery to make it useful for your goals. So what do you have currently? Have you done to them? How did you get to that point?
Yeah, so some of that is a little out of date, but I still have two machines that are homemade sort of CNC kits that I designed myself. When I first got into machining, I was just doing manual machine work. From there, I became interested in learning CNC, but I didn't have the budget for it. And like most people who are interested in learning something, you don't start out with a budget unless unless you're a business or you are someone with working capital. And that's just not the that's just not the life of an artist. As an artist, you have this idea, but you don't have funding. So I actually was fortunate to I applied for a couple of grants from I got one very big grant from the Pollock Krasner Foundation. Most people are familiar with Jackson Pollock, so his estate has a grant program for sculptors and painters and anyone who's looking for resources to primarily. A lot of the grants go to people who have high operating costs or trying to expand their shop or their art studio and things like that. So I got a pretty decent grant from them, but it wasn't enough to buy off the shelf CNC equipment. So I just used that money to do a first conversion of a large manual bed mill to a CNC machine. And the first one I did was a kit. So I just bought a kit from a guy. The company I think is defunct at this point, but it was called Industrial Hobbies at the time. And sort of I learned how to retrofit a machine from there. And that one experience was enough for me to take all of those skills and build my own kits and build a couple of other machines. And so my first CNC machines were a large CNC mill, and then I retrofit my 14 by 40 CNC manual lathe that I had at the time, which I still use today. And I actually had a small 9 by 20 Grizzly was my first real CNC, and it's a piece of junk, and I still have it. And I'm still running it right now, but uh, it's got its limits. But yeah, so my first machine shop was like 3 tools, and 2 of them I'm still using, and I've since upgraded to like a couple of different Tormach machines that are just sort of off the shelf turnkey systems. But I'm an artist. I don't have. It's not. I've actually found some pretty good success in the last couple of years. But it's not like where you're running a day-to-day manufacturing business where you have a steady stream of income and you have a steady stream of customers and you're making some widget or some product that has a steady demand. And so my income fluctuates with how well I'm generating and executing ideas. And so there's an ebb and flow to that. And so, there's a certain amount of modesty you have to build into your operating costs. And so another limitation I have is that my studio is in my basement, which is the ceiling. The ceiling in my basement is 6 foot 6 inches. So I have this much room above my head,
Oh goodness, yeah.
and everything has to fit through a 36-inch door. That's a limitation I work with. And at first I used to feel constrained by that, but I sort of feel like I'd like to have a big shop. I'll just come out and say it. I'd like to have a big, beautiful, gleaming shop, but I don't. And I'm not going to let that be a constraint that limits me. I'm just going to let that be a constraint that makes me more creative. And so I make do with the tools that I can fit. And for at least for now, anyway. And I think there's like a lesson in that. I talk to a lot of like younger machinists who are like, like you said, there's an assumption that I have this big, like state of the art facility that I'm making these. They're very ambitious, big machined pieces that are would definitely be I'd have an easier time making them on that kind of equipment. But I talk to young machinists who are like, if I had a Haas, I could really I could make beautiful art like you, but I don't. So I'm not going to try. And it's like, don't wait for the right machine, just get the right now machine and make stuff, and that just sort of helps me kind of keep that in perspective as I'm making things. And Tormach machines are perfectly capable machines, at least in the prototyping and, small batch arena anyway. It's not, if you're trying to make the most parts in the least amount of time for the least amount of money, well, then that's not the right machine for you. But if you're just trying to make the part well and you only need, several dozen of them because you're trying to do something conceptually that's not necessarily tied to profit or anything, then they're perfectly fun machines to use.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I wasn't at all trying to disparage what you have.
Yeah,
I just,
yeah,
I think that all that does is show, especially somebody who's self-taught as a machinist, it's incredibly impressive what you're able to do without, because it does make it that much easier when you have,
yeah.
probing and all the top of the line tools and gizmos and gadgets. It makes all that stuff that much easier. So the fact that you're able to turn out these quite large pieces sometimes is really impressive.
Yeah, I gotta say that there's something that's not appreciated about the cheap lower end machines, and especially like Tormax and that are still running on stepper motors and things like that. Is, if you're learning machining for the first time, or you're still a little green, there is nothing better than having a machine that you can crash at full. You can crash it at full speed, and it won't hurt the machine at all. I don't crash my machines very often, but when I do, there's never it's not a $10,000 oops. You know what I mean? I scrapped a part, I changed the insert, and I rehome the machine, and I keep going. And it's just
Right.
because they're underpowered, and the steppers just slip, and they don't drive the machine into oblivion. And I think that's underappreciated. In at least from the perspective of learning a craft, and as an artist who is always making something new and always making something that in a way that I've not necessarily done before. You're always in that sort of space where accidents are much more likely to happen, because you're not setting up a process and running it for the next 12 years. I'm not making the same knife or pen or whatever it is that I've made for the last decade, and I just have to set the palette and set the parameters and run it. Everything, at least every couple of weeks, I'm doing something that I've never done before, and so there's some value in that.
Yeah, no, I think that that's a point well taken, because as somebody who learned both in school and in a shop at my job, the stakes are so high, you are constantly clenched waiting for that next big mistake. So,
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely been in, like, bigger shops where, like, they're like, I've seen videos on, like, Titans of CNC, and they've got this $500,000 machine, and they have, so and so today is running his first part in this machine, and you can just tell there's like 8 guys making sure they don't trash the machine. And I don't know if that's I don't know if that would be a good environment for me to learn in, for sure. I just need to be left alone to make my mistakes and learn from them, because I mean, most people learn as much, if not more, from their mistakes, and machining isn't one of those environments where they let you make mistakes.
oh yeah, I've said it every now and again that, like, people come off in this industry as having such large egos,
Hmm.
and I think that a lot of that is in part that they are running a machine that they could never afford on their own for years, and they have to at least show off enough, like, oh yeah, I got this and I can do whatever, to their bosses, that they are willing to let them try out all these new parts, especially in a prototype shop. Like, we're a job shop as well, and so I'm doing between 5 and 10 new part numbers every week or two. And so it's the same thing. It's like, well, I've never tried this before. I've tried something like it. I hope it works out. Like, we'll see.
Yeah, I gotta say, I've never actually worked in a machine shop, so I don't know. I don't have any firsthand experience of what that environment is like. But to bring it back to a fine art sort of line of thinking, is that if you look to a lot of industrial crafts that have become these sort of fine art staples, like glass making, fine wood turning, and a bunch of other different metalworking processes that are now, like, widely accepted as, like, fine art mediums. They don't like, if you look back into their history, they don't really become creative mediums in their own right until the technology gets sufficiently, it's not even sufficiently advanced, but sufficiently small enough for a single person to own it and have it in a studio and use it in an environment where there are no other people around bugging them, or controlling what they do with it. And sort of machine work has always been that perennial craft where it's like you have to have a factory around it, or else it doesn't make financial sense. But now all of a sudden there are all these desktop tools, and there are all these lower end pieces of equipment that artists can get a hold of. And some of that has become, sort of micro businesses and micro manufacturing that's just sort of a much more traditional money making venture. But then there's, like, oddballs like me, and Richard Stadler is someone that I've collaborated with a lot, who are doing, like, more creative things on the side with it. But from my perspective, if you can't own it, like if you can't own the machine in a garage and like I said, crash it if you want to, then it really isn't gonna. You're really not going to be in a great environment to make sort of like groundbreaking art with it. And maker spaces have created some room for artists to get in there and really play with the tools and experiment, but they're still pretty rigid environments. And so, I say, you just have to be able to own the tool. And so these low end, cheaper machines are actually where it's at in terms of making fine art, not the high end Okumas and things like that.
Yeah, that makes total sense. It's yeah, and when there's something to be said, I mean, you were talking about your space limitations, but there's something to be said to be able to go downstairs and work, at any time.
Yeah,
Like one of my
yeah,
customers has a home shop that he does all his work out of, and he might not have as nice machinery as me, but you know what? He can go and put something in the machine and start running it, and then go eat dinner. And it's like I've got to
yeah.
drive home and all that stuff. So I definitely am envious of that kind of
So
freedom.
yeah, where I'm sitting right now, my office is on the first floor of my house, and so my shop is in the basement. And my milling machine is literally 2 feet below my feet. Like, if you just go through the floor, I'm sitting right on top of it, and so I can hit cycle start and come up here and eat my lunch. And I know at least I can hear if something's going sideways downstairs. It's I've soundproofed it some, but it's an interesting thing to. I know that I know that is a very unique situation. I think to be sitting on top of your machines, but yeah, it's 8 steps down in the basement, and I can bounce between work and life, and that's very helpful. I've considered building a shop in the backyard at some point, but even that seems like it's too far. I have to walk across the yard. So
Oh man, yeah, that's a really it's nice flexibility for sure. Like I feel like at least on some days there are days where I would get a lot more done in my shop if it was that close, because I could go run one part and not feel like, oh, I just wasted an hour with getting ready and round trip commute and all that stuff. So yeah, that's incredibly nice.
yeah, there is a temptation to not shut down your machines at night because you're literally right. Like every morning you go down and you turn them on, you home them, you set them up, and you burn half an hour, 45 minutes just kind of getting things up and going. And at the end of the day, you're like, I could just not hit that e-stop button and just let them hum all night long. And then they'd just be set up in the morning and I could just keep going. Most times I shut it down unless I forget. I have forgotten. It happens.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, you get busy upstairs and you just don't go back
Yep.
downstairs.
Well, I have a 2.5-year-old running around too, so that'll make you forget what you're doing real quick.
Oh yeah, definitely. So I had written down some questions that I was curious about. My first one was, what's your favorite material to work with? You do quite a bit of multi-material pieces as well as a wide variety of metals. So what is your favorite, what's your go-to, I guess, when you're designing?
I mean, I'd like to say that it's like a situation where like I have a favorite and because for various properties, but I mean, I predominantly make things out of aluminum because structurally it's light, it's cheap. I can, anodize it. It's pretty flexible, but it's not because I am in love with that as a material. But some of the pieces, you really look at it from a weight perspective, from volume. Like my last larger sculpture, it weighs about 75 pounds, 80 pounds, and it's made out of aluminum. If I were to change to nearly any other material, stainless, anything, it would just jump to 300 pounds. It would, it's
Jeez.
literally about mass, and it just doesn't make sense on paper to do a lot of big things in anything other than aluminum. And then for smaller things, I just, stay in the stainless, brass, multicolored arena, just because those are that's the palette that the world of machining has for you, right? It's your brass, your red metals, and your silver metals. And I try to, when I'm designing a piece, I just try to make sure that the aesthetic that I choose for each design makes sense within that design. I'm definitely not in that camp of very common in sort of the small machined object community to design something and then make that design out of every metal in the universe. And like you'll see, a spinning top design. And Richard Stadler does this, and I don't hold it against him, but you come up with one design and you do it in brass, you do it in stainless, you do it in copper, you do it in Mokum, you do it in titanium, you do it in Timascus, and it's for me that's like the thief of joy to do every iteration of something.
Right.
I think it's more fun to say, well, this design needs this particular material combination. And I've certainly gone down the road where I design something and I'm going to make it in aluminum, and I'm just like, you can pick the colors because the color scheme for aluminum anodizing isn't necessarily relevant, but it's not a process change to run aluminum different colors. It is a process change to switch from copper to titanium to something else. I mean, when you're machining different metals, you really got to get back in there and retune your tool paths and your feeds and all that stuff. And I don't think running through that process is fun for me. Once I have the design and a working prototype, I sort of there's no more when I design. Let me say that a different way. When I design something, there's sort of this. I have a visual plan, and then there are the constraints of the process which I'm using to make it, and
Hmm.
those two things bounce back and forth on each other until I have a final design that I can actually make. And so at that point, changing the material would have some sort of influence on the design. So if I were to change that material, I'd have to change the design in some sort of way. And so once the cake is baked, it's baked.
All right. Yeah, that's totally fair. So that actually kind of dovetails nicely into one of my other questions, which was how long is your typical design process? And I guess you can kind of break that up because you do smaller. I'm not sure what you define them as, but hand sculptures versus
Mhm.
large 75-pound or large sculptures. So how long do I guess each of those usually take you to design and bring to at least a prototype? I guess.
I think it's a pretty wide spectrum, actually. There are definitely situations where I just have an idea, I sit down, and within 3 days, I have a prototype in my hand. But that's pretty rare. The bigger pieces I can, I'd say on the long end of the spectrum of for design to a finished piece would be 3 years. Just work on I have a whole folder of ideas, and so I'll work on an idea, and I just can't quite crack it, so I set it aside, and I come up with, and I work on something else, and I'll revisit it, and the experiences I've had in the interim, I'm actually to borrow some of that and add to it, and sort of come back and go back and forth between. I have a lot of ideas that are sort of running in the background that I revisit from time to time, and what I know when it's ready, and at that point, once I actually say, okay, this is actually good enough to make, taking that rough sketch and actually drafting up a machinable plan for it, and getting it made, it can for bigger pieces it can take a year. The general time frame for making anything is 3 months, so I try not to waste more than 3 months of shop time on any single idea. So even if I'm doing an edition of small works, I'll make a bunch of them, but I'm not going to make them forever. I'll give 3 months. Like, I figure any idea is worth giving 3 months of my time to. And so the bigger pieces I'll make one and it can take me 3 months, or the little pieces I'll make 50 of them and it'll take me 3 months to make them. And so they both actually occupy about the same amount of my shop time once I actually get into making chips and producing the parts.
Cool. So, like, what about the most recent one, Sculpture 130? How long has that been kicking around in your head?
I don't know which one that is. I
Oh, that's
number them.
that's
I
the most recent one, the
the
blue and
Yeah,
and orange
yeah,
and wood one.
yeah. That one I would say, yeah. So let me just go back there. The reason that the number 130 doesn't mean anything to me, that's just on my website, so that when other people, it's incredibly hard for people to describe pieces to me like you just did. And so I put the numbers on them, and then people just email me and they say this number, and I actually have to go look because I still don't know what the number is. So
Okay.
in conversation, the number system completely breaks down and it doesn't work for me. But like, if you email me, I'll know which one you're talking about. So yeah, the most recent work is it's a big machined like blue and orange firecracker with a lot of like wood inlays and things like that. That piece took a long time to machine too, and it stretched into 4 months, which is a little bit out of my my norm. But so that one's is an interesting piece. So the base design, the 8 spheres in a little square arrangement, I actually made a piece like that 10 years ago, and it was just one of those things where I was sort of looking over my body of work, and I was and most design elements or things that I like to call, each little design hook that I come up with, I normally iterate around that a little bit. So I'll make 2 or 3 pieces around some sort of element or concept that I want to experiment with. And that piece was just this lone sculpture that didn't there was no iteration took place. I made it. Then I had another better idea right after that, and I went down a tangent and I never revisited it. So I just sort of saw it and I was like, I think I had this other design I was working on that didn't quite make sense, and I was able to kind of do both of those things at once: revisit an old idea, combine it with a bunch of new stuff I was working on, and make something that was completely fresh and new out of it. And so you could say that the design process took either 10 years or a year and a half. I don't know which one works for you, but
Okay. No, that's really cool. It
that's
when I first
probably way
saw
too specific.
no, it's super cool, and it's when I first saw that piece finished on your Instagram, I thought it was a render because it looks so otherworldly. It really doesn't look like a real piece, so I-
Yeah.
it's really cool.
Photographing those pieces is strangely emotional because I don't know how many machinists have this problem. I know some artists have this problem, but you have this idealized image in your head of what the finished product will be, right? Because when you work in CAD and you work in SolidWorks, you're actually you're dealing in these geometric ideals, right? Nothing's a perfect sphere, but in SolidWorks, everything's a perfect sphere. And so when you finish a piece, you really like reconcile like this ideal you had with what you've actually done. And even though from the perspective of most laymen, it's exactly executed precisely as I envisioned it. Like seeing it in real life is jarring, and so when you're photographing the piece, you're still trying to, like for me anyway, you're still trying to wrap your head around like this real object that's here. And so that whole process of like setting up the studio lights and photographing it and processing those images, and yeah, so like you said, they do sort of look like a render, and some of that is intentional to blow the background out and make sure that there's this like contrast. It's because there's this dissonance between the ideal of the design and the reality of the execution. And so I try to make the images a bridge between those two things for myself, I guess, to help me kind of, I don't know how else to say that. I don't know if that made sense at all, but it's making these things is sort of an emotional process, I guess.
I think that totally makes sense. I think even as machinists, we build up things for so long.
Yeah,
Even when I'm designing a process for a customer part, I have this vision of how it's going to sound cutting and how it's going to work and how it's going to look off the machine. And it sometimes exceeds my expectations and
yeah,
sometimes blows up in my face. So I can at least somewhat understand that.
yeah. I guess the other way to say that is like if I were to just take the piece and set it on a desk next to a soda can and my computer and just take pictures of it in that real environment, right? That would be jarring and disturbing to me, right? Because it's taking that thing that you've been idealizing for months and months and putting it in this environment that just seems so unnatural for it. And so it's really, I know a lot of artists that just take their finished piece and just set it on their front porch and just take a photograph of it. But I can't bring myself to do that. And so the only context where you'll see images of my sculptures in an environment is when they're on display at an exhibition or in a museum or something like that, because there's a certain, I don't know, it's just jarring for me to just hold it in my hand and like shoot it, at least the bigger pieces.
That's totally fair. So you also make these smaller hand-sized sculptures, or
Hmm.
they're sometimes kinetic. Big question I had was shipping these. What kind of lessons have you learned shipping valuable pieces that you've dedicated hours to, around the world? Because a lot of my listeners and I have dealt with shipping customer parts all over and
Hmm.
had FedEx and UPS destroy them or ding them or throw them off the back of a truck.
Yeah.
What lessons can you impart that's to keep really valuable pieces safe?
Yeah, I've actually been incredibly lucky. I've lost a few things and had some damage, like everyone has. I I honestly think the best thing to do is to actually mark the real value on the box. And I know a lot of people don't want to do that because international customs can you can accrue VAT taxes, and people have this tendency to take an expensive object, put it in a box, and put $1 on it and stick it in the mail, and that's why things get lost. I don't really think FedEx and UPS are in the business of losing things that are worth thousands of dollars, and I certainly haven't had that experience. I've had crates dropped off of trucks because the guy unloading it was too heavy and smashed the corner of a crate. Things like that happen, but I don't think things disappear too much when you put the actual value on it. But that's just my sort of. I don't have any hard evidence for that, but I would say I've lost less than a half dozen pieces over the years, and I've shipped thousands of pieces everywhere. At least having them go missing. I've certainly had things crushed because FedEx fills their trucks too much, uh, or overfills their trucks and damages things, or sort of like had parts that are in, even though they're in foam, somehow they were jarred so hard that they were able to compress all the foam and cling together inside of the box. And so I kind of make it a habit to, if things are in pieces, to have them in separate boxes within boxes, as opposed to foam. Foam isn't as reliable as you think it is, and so I'm sort of learning as I go too. But it hasn't, there was the whole fiasco with the postal service over the last Christmas holiday, just completely grinding to a halt, and certainly I was affected by that as well as everyone else. But nothing was lost; it was just in a truck, sitting somewhere for 3 months, and finally, got unloaded and delivered. And so
Yeah,
I,
I think those are great
I
lessons.
don't, yeah, I
The
don't think I
box.
have too much wisdom to share there.
I think the thing you said about box within a box, like I do that. I've started to do that a lot more now, and that seems, fingers crossed, so far to
Yeah.
have mitigated a lot of the crushing or dinging. I had a large fixture plate that got sent out maybe a year ago to a customer, and I thought I had bubble wrapped it to the nth degree, and somehow it still showed up with like a quarter-inch ding in one of the corners because I don't know, they were playing football with it or something.
So for the really big pieces, the one we've been discussing, that's actually being shipped to Australia in a couple months, and that is going to be picked up and professionally packaged by art shippers and created professionally by art shippers, and it's you have to do that because if it does end up damaged, it cannot be your fault. It cannot be your liability, and so that's incredibly expensive, and no one wants to do it. But for this sort of thing, where I don't actually have the setups in place anymore to make spare parts for a piece like that. So if it did get damaged, it would be not irreparably damaged, but incredibly expensive to fix. In the sense that I would have to reinvent the wheel to remake some of those parts. It's not like the apparatus to make them is just sitting on a shelf somewhere. And so
Right.
it would be faster, but it wouldn't be. And color matching anodizing after the fact is a nightmare. And so it's just one of those things. So let's just not damage it. Let's just make sure it gets there. So
Definitely.
you pay the money.
So, what do you find more emotionally jarring? Taking pictures and having that physical realization, or shipping your part? You just spent 4 months on this. How does it affect you shipping that off to somebody? Like,
Um,
have you had your time with it and you're ready to pass it on, or is it really tough to sell it and send it to somebody?
Well, the small additions, I'm making dozens and dozens of them, so that's not such a big deal. Actually, whenever I of all of the small additions I make, I have my what I call my archival copy. So I actually have my own set of each of the editions just for posterity. At some point, there will be an exhibition of those. I showed most of them at the National Museum of Industrial History last year. But
Oh,
for
cool.
the bigger pieces, what I tend to do is when I sell them, is almost all of my buyers agree to loan the work at any moment I need it for exhibition. So, it's not like I'll never see it again. I have pretty good relationships with most of my collectors. So the piece we just discussed was purchased before it was even completed, but the buyers generously allowed me to keep it for a whole year to exhibit it. So I'm it's going to be here for another 6 or 7 months before I ship it. And unfortunately, because of COVID, there's just everything's closed, and so an exhibition opportunity seems to be not impossible, but it's going to be difficult to get anything going. But I'm going to try, and I try to make sure all of my larger pieces have like at least one public showing before they go into private collection, and that's been pretty good. That I've been pretty good at that, being consistent with that, so that it does no good if you make something and it just goes into the black hole of a collection. So most of my collectors are willing to lend work back, and I've borrowed pieces from dozens of collectors over the years to just have a second exhibition at various galleries or museums.
That's great. It sounds like your relationship with your collectors is fantastic.
Yeah, and I think there's like like I said, so I'm not like a you know like a traditional commercial business where I'm just selling things to anonymous people, especially with the big work. It's really these relationships that have been built up over many pieces. I've got most of my collectors are repeat collectors, and so I know them quite well at this point. And just sort of they're collecting because they like the work, but they're also collecting because they want me to continue doing what I'm doing. And so it's this, I don't know, I guess from a business perspective, it's exactly the kind of business you like to have, which is that your customers are deeply invested in your ability to go forward.
That's great. Yeah. So do most of your large pieces go to a group of the same buyers then?
Let me think about that. Without being too specific, I would say a good portion of them go to repeat buyers, but I feel like I'm adding I add new collectors every year too. So it's a big mix, and as of late, it's one of those things. I feel incredibly fortunate to even have to say this, but when I make a big piece like that, I really have to do this horrible thing where like I have multiple people who are interested, and I have to pick a winner because I only have one to sell. And I think a lot of people, it's an interesting. It's I mean, it's an interesting position to be in as someone who's got to make a living, but it's also an interesting position to be in as an artist to have to pick a winner. And so I a lot of times I'll just randomly pick somebody from a hat because I just can't, I don't want to hurt feelings either. And so it's strange.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds like a very unique situation for sure. So you had kind of mentioned earlier when you're designing that you find a machining technique or something like that that you want to explore.
Hmm.
When it comes to movement pieces, your kinetic ones with slides and magnets, is it the same thing that you find kind of an interaction between moving pieces that you want to explore and then you create a piece around it, or how do you decide what magnets to put where? And like your most recent one is four pieces that come together as magnets, right?
Eight.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
that's eight. Well, that one in particular, I think. So the small pieces started out as sort of this. I wanted to acknowledge some of the trends I was observing in and around the machinist community. There was a lot of like small kinetic art, and obviously the fidget spinner thing was a thing for a brief moment in time. And as a sculptor, my primary interest is making something that reads as a piece of fine art, right? I want to make an object that is like sculpturally self-contained. So the idea of adding motion, the idea of adding functionality is kind of contrary to that, because when you have functionality, you have visible hinges, you have the hardware starts to get in the way of the visual design. And so, first and foremost, my primary focus is making sure that whatever it is reads 100% as a visual object. And so, if I'm gonna put motion into it, I do so extremely cautiously, I guess is what I should say. But I don't I got a little lost there, but I think what I really wanted to say was, I've sort of started making these small pieces as a reaction to some of the trends I was seeing in the machinist community. There were these little commercial trends, like people making fidget spinners, people making key fobs and lanyard beads, and there was all of these really interesting visual elements in all of them, but they all had this very specific function that I thought was a good opportunity to make art, but also was a little problematic from the perspective of making art. So I just thought that was a very tough challenge to sort of make work about that trend without falling victim to some of its trappings, as far as like having too much function to where people say, well, what is it? Well, it's a bottle opener. What is it? It's a credit card wallet. Because there was so much interesting visual material in that community, but I wanted to use it. I wanted to respond to it, but I still wanted to make sculpture. So I found what I think is my happy compromise is that they're some of my small pocket, I call them pocket sculptures. Some of them are purely sculptural. They don't do anything. Some of them have functionality, but that functionality is trivial. It doesn't really do anything specific. It doesn't have a use. I mean, some people, are into it just from the fidget perspective, but for me, it's sort of I appreciate that, and I sort of lean into that a little bit. But I'm still primarily just trying to make sculpture that speaks to those trends without being completely gobbled up by them, I guess.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, your most recent one was the SPG, right?
That was the rotating, yeah, the rotating one that
Yeah.
had some magnets inside. Yeah, so that was sort of a response to I've seen fidget coins that there's like this whole rotating motion, and fidget coins are haptic coins. I'm saying it
Mhm.
wrong. Haptic coins. They're really interesting. The mechanic is really interesting. And I've seen some sort of decorative applications for them that are also really sort of striking and interesting. But at the end of the day, they are just like a flat disc, and from a sculptural perspective, that's really limiting. And so it's like, well, what can I do with that? What can I do with that? That's builds on that, makes it more interesting, makes it my own, makes it something that speaks to that trend without necessarily being beholden to the idea that it's got to be a coin that you can put in your pocket. And from there, the idea just grew until it became its own thing. So most people, maybe a bunch of people, don't think that it's very analogous and it doesn't matter, but that's sort of was the starting point for it.
Yeah, and you have these great stands for them too, so they do serve as a sculptural piece when they're not, in your
Yeah.
hand.
And I was sort of able to fold some of the woodwork I was doing with some of the designs I made recently. And that's sort of another thread in all of this, is that, at this point in machining, as in my journey as a machinist and as a sculptor, I'm sort of looking for these, because within the world of machinists, there's lots of little communities, right? There's knife makers, there's gun groups, there's people who just make parts for commercially, there's people who work on motorcycles, and there's lots of little smaller communities that each have their own little cultural ticks, like design aesthetics and things like that. And so I've sort of, I don't know, I've just become a tourist. I keep, I think they're all incredibly inspiring, but I don't really belong to any one of them. But and so I've started doing a couple of pieces around what I can learn from the knife making community without making knives specifically. So I'm my approach to that was to sort of take the idea of a knife as a craft object, as a sort of decorative craft object, and sort of just mash that up with other decorative crafts that I'm more familiar with. And so the first one I made was, it was just a flower vase that was completely ringed by what's essentially knife blades, and use that as this sort of like self-defeating object that speaks to what's interesting about both of those crafts. And so that's sort of another weird road that I've just gone down, because I admire these communities, but at the end of the day, I'm still just trying to be my own artist that's sort of commenting on those trends without necessarily becoming a knife maker, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I think that's a great approach to it because you still get to play in those fields, but stay true to your art and stay true to
Yeah.
yourself.
I mean, and there's just so much to learn. I mean, you could spend a lifetime just learning the ins and outs of knife making, right? There's lots of people who do. They've been in that world for 40 years, and they're still learning new things, and it's kind of a disservice, but also I don't know. It's to just dabble in it and then move on is sort of I feel like I need to be careful at the very least not to do it an injustice. So I want to be respectful when I make these things, but at the same time I recognize I could never learn enough to really do it justice.
I think you definitely did it justice in your own way. I mean, that knife vessel on your website is gorgeous, and it is really cool to see it with flowers in it.
Yeah, it's sitting right over there, and again, it's one of those ones that I'm borrowing for a little bit, and then it's gonna go live with its owner someday. Um, but
Well, cool. I wanted to. I've got two questions when we wrap up. One is what's currently going on in your shop. So you're currently making those smaller magnetic pieces.
yeah, so the smaller magnetic pieces, which I'm calling the NC3, it's also like sort of a response to the bigger blue piece. It's the same sort of the 8 spheres in a cube configuration, but a whole like different approach where the assemblage is magnetic, and what can be what can you do with that? How does that change the composition, and how does that change the approach to making an object when you don't have to have this big mechanical apparatus? So yeah, so that's in production. I'll probably be done in 3 or 4 weeks, and I'm actually working on another knife specific piece. So that's one of those. It's one of those themes where I'm just gonna kind of, when I sat down to do the knife vessel, the first one, it was sort of, I had a plan. I had a plan for how I was going to approach that concept, but I didn't have the time. So this will be the next installment in that little saga. And then once that's done, it'll be on another sort of larger, more traditional sculpture piece.
Awesome. And then you also just recently repaired your lathe, right?
Yeah, my old friend, was giving me some trouble. So yeah, it was. So it turned out I think what it turned out was, so for years I'd had this little bit of backlash in it, and I just couldn't find it. Like I would check make sure there's no slop in any of the carriage, and it was this. I thought it was. I actually convinced myself it was something electrical or something with the encoder, or just like a bad spot. And anyone who builds and fixes their own machines will know what it's like to chase a problem. But what it turned out to be was some washers between bearings that weren't missing, to the point where there was visible slop. Like you really had to pound on it. The washers were torn, so the only time the backlash would appear was under a heavy load. And when there was enough load, the washers would squish out of the way and create just a little bit of backlash. So when you're checking, it's there's nothing to find unless you really, So it's one of those things that just dogged me for years, and I finally took it apart all the way, and I figured out what it was. But I think that it was a very instructive repair that needed to be made.
Well, congrats on finding an intermittent
So maybe
problem.
I'll make a sculpture about that someday. I don't know.
That'd be cool. Yeah, something that squishes
Yeah.
some washers out of the way, create movement or something
You'd
like
be
that.
surprised, where ideas come from, I guess, is what I wanted to say there.
Yeah, that's incredible. And then the last question I always ask all of my guests to round out the episode is, what have you been researching this week? It doesn't need to be machining related. I just bring on a lot of interesting people, and there's so much out there that we all geek out on, and it's always interesting to hear what people are currently looking at.
I don't know if this counts as researching. So again, this is kind of, I've been looking at Tormac's little teeny tiny lathe that they just released, and I'm not researching it from the perspective of learning something new, but I just really like small machine tools, and I'm actually just, I'm researching it, like trying to figure out how it's made, because I want to see if I can buy one, take it apart, and make it do more than what it currently does. And if I can't, then oh well. But it's one of those things where it's become this weird little hobby where I like getting little machines and trying to squeeze as much out of them as I can. But that's what comes to mind.
I think that's totally worthy of what you were researching this week.
I'm not trying to be a brand on brand or anything like that. It's just sort of how the cookie crumbled.
Definitely, definitely. Well, again, Chris, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. Real quick at the end, where can they find you again, just so they can go and check out all the things we were talking about?
Yeah, sure. Old school website is www.chrisbathgate.com, and on Instagram at c_Bathgate.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you for the time. I appreciate it. And we'll see you guys next week.
Thanks for having me on.